Hello, my dear listeners. Today I want to start by sending a warm hug to three very special listeners. Ivy Nicklin from England, Elizabeth Coombs from Ontario, Canada, and Teresa Niles from Marietta, Ohio. Thank you for always being here. It's such a joy to have you as part of our community. And what about you? Have you told me where you're listening from? Leave a comment. I love getting to know each corner of the world these beautiful messages come from. And who knows, maybe your name will be featured in the next video too. Now then, let's begin today's story. Sarah Gaines sat alone in her new apartment, the silence of the unfamiliar city pressing down on her. She was surrounded by unpacked boxes and the ghosts of her recent divorce. She was trying to focus on updating her resume, but her mind kept drifting to the daunting reality of starting over at 26. The shrill ring of her cell phone startled her. It was an unknown number. She sighed, answering with a weary professionalism. Before she could utter the word, hello, a deep, masculine voice, a voice that was smooth, rich, and utterly exhausted, fired a volley of words into her ear. Tina, I know I'm not the most exciting guy in the world, and maybe I should have seen the signs when you started taking up night classes on Tuesdays. But cheating on me with my best friend, that felt a little excessive, didn't it? Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice held no rage, no shouting, but a devastating mix of sarcasm and raw vulnerability that was deeply unsettling. The man sounded less angry and more profoundly, bitterly disappointed. Sarah, who understood the sting of betrayal better than she cared to admit, felt a strange, protective impulse rise within her. Sir, she interrupted gently, her voice barely a whisper, I think you have the wrong number. The man on the other end stopped mid-sentence. There was a long, heavy silence, broken only by a sharp, audible intake of breath. Then came a low groan of mortification. Oh no, he muttered, the sound thick with embarrassment. You're not Tina? No, Sarah confirmed, a nervous giggle escaping her. I'm Sarah. And unless this is some elaborate prank, I believe you've just poured out your marital drama to a complete stranger. The man sighed, a long, defeated sound. I am so sorry. I was nervous. I was driving. I was clearly not paying attention. I must have dialed the last digit wrong. It happens, Sarah said, trying to sound nonchalant, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. The honesty in his voice was captivating. My name is Colin, he offered, his tone regaining a sliver of his earlier charm. And I owe you a massive apology for that truly abysmal opening line. Well, Colin, Sarah replied, a genuine smile finally touching her lips. It was certainly the most interesting thing to happen to me all week, and for what it's worth, Tina is clearly an idiot. That simple validation, a shared moment of dark humor, was the crack in the dam. What should have been a 20-second apology turned into an hour-long conversation. They talked about the absurdity of adult dating, the pain of unexpected endings, and the awkwardness of trying to rebuild a life. Colin's humor was quick and dry, and Sarah found herself laughing harder than she had in months. Finally, Sarah glanced at the clock. It was late. I really need to get some sleep, she said, a reluctant finality in her voice. I have a job interview tomorrow. Right. Of course, Colin said quickly. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken desire. Sarah. He hesitated, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. This is insane, but could I call you again? Just to talk? You have a really calming voice. Sarah's stomach fluttered. She knew the danger of this request. She knew the risk. Only as friends, he insisted, though neither of them believed the lie. Okay, Colin, she agreed, the word barely a breath. Call me. She hung up the phone, her hand still warm from the device. She walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. A nervous, exciting chill ran down her spine, the kind that promised dreams. What did I just do? She whispered to the empty room, a wide, slightly panicked smile spreading across her face. 2 weeks passed, and the routine became an essential, non-negotiable part of Sarah's new life. At precisely 10 p.m., her phone would ring. The conversation would often begin with a silly internal joke, a reference to Tina, a commentary on the day's absurdities, a secret language they had built in the safety of the dark. The anonymity of the phone line had allowed them to bypass the superficiality of typical dating. They shared fears, dreams, and vulnerabilities with an honesty that neither would have dared to attempt face-to-face. Sarah learned that Colin was fiercely intelligent, driven, and often lonely. He spoke of business trips to distant cities and late nights working in silent, empty spaces. He never explicitly mentioned his wealth, but the details were undeniable. The casual mention of a private jet, the frustration with staff, the ease with which he dismissed multi-million-dollar problems. He was rich, but deeply isolated. Colin, in turn, was fascinated by Sarah's gentle humor and her resilience. He loved the sound of her voice, a soft, melodic tone that seemed to cut through the noise of his complicated life. He knew about her recent divorce, her fear of failure in the new city, and her quiet determination to rebuild her career. The connection was a fragile, beautiful bubble of intimacy. They were two broken strangers, finding solace in the sound of each other's voices. One night, the conversation took a sharp turn toward the serious. Sarah was telling him about a difficult moment at her new job, a moment where she felt truly defeated. "I just felt so invisible, Colin," she confessed, her voice tight, like no one even saw me trying. There was a long silence on the line. Sarah could hear the faint sound of his breathing, the soft static of the connection. "That's impossible, Sarah," Colin finally said, his voice dropping to a low, intense register that sent a ripple of warmth across her skin. "I don't know what you look like. I don't know your history, but I see you. You are the most visible person in my life right now." He paused, then confessed, his voice thick with a vulnerability that stole her breath. "I'm falling in love with your voice, Sarah. You are the only person who makes me feel normal, safe." Sarah's palms grew instantly damp. The air in the room seemed to thicken. The casual, friends-only facade they had maintained for 2 weeks shattered into a million pieces. "Colin," she managed, her throat suddenly dry. "I know," he interrupted, his voice regaining a fraction of its control. "It's absurd, but it's true. I need to know if this magic is real, or if it's just the safety of the dark." He took a deep breath. "I want to see you. Let's meet. Just coffee. We can destroy the magic together, or we can see if it survives the light." Sarah's stomach churned with a mixture of terror and exhilarating anticipation. The fear of disappointment, that the reality would crush the fantasy, was immense. But the curiosity, the intense need to put a face to the voice that had become her lifeline, was stronger. "Okay," she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "Coffee. Where and when?" They set the time and place, a small, bustling cafe downtown. Sarah hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly. She walked to the bathroom mirror and stared at her reflection. She was about to meet the man who knew her deepest secrets, the man she was falling for, the man who might be a complete disaster in person. The tension was almost unbearable. Sarah arrived at the bustling downtown cafe 10 minutes early, a nervous flutter deep in her stomach. She wore a simple dress and a light jacket, her honey-brown hair falling in soft waves. She felt exposed, stripped of the comforting anonymity of the telephone. She scanned the room, unconsciously looking for a man who fit her mental image. Perhaps a kind, slightly disheveled academic, maybe a bit older, with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived a full life. She chose a discreet table near the window and ordered a tea, trying to appear calm. Her fingers nervously traced the rim of the mug. Then, the bell above the door chimed. Sarah looked up, and the teacup almost slipped from her grasp. Standing in the doorway was a man who defied every expectation. He wasn't older. He looked mid-30s, maybe 35. He wasn't disheveled. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit jacket and crisp shirt, the fabric hinting at high quality. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and possessed a natural, effortless confidence that commanded the space. His hair was a rich brown, falling naturally across his forehead, and a hint of rugged stubble framed a strong jawline. Most strikingly, his eyes, a warm, intelligent hazel, were scanning the room with a focused intensity that made her skin tingle. He found her. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that instantly softened his confident features, making him devastatingly handsome. Colin Langford crossed the room with the purposeful stride of a man used to getting what he wanted. Sarah was completely captivated by his physical presence, the sheer reality of him. He stopped at her table, his eyes warm and appreciative. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice the same rich, familiar melody that had been her nightly comfort. "Colin," she managed, her voice a little breathless. He sat down, leaning slightly toward her. "I have to say," he began, a playful glint in his eye, "I was expecting a voice that beautiful to belong to someone far less real." Sarah felt a blush creep up her neck. She laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. "I'm surprised you're not older," she confessed, shaking her head. "I imagined you as a kind, eccentric professor who was probably wearing a cardigan with holes in the elbows." Colin chuckled, the sound deep and resonant. "And I imagined you as a wise, slightly timid librarian. I was wrong. You are far sweeter and much less timid than I imagined." The physical attraction was immediate and overwhelming, confirming that the connection was not just a trick of the voice. It was real, and it was potent. The sheer relief that the reality was not only not disappointing, but actively exhilarating, washed over them both. Colin reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. "Your voice is much more beautiful in person, Sarah." "And you," she replied, her gaze holding his, "are much more dangerous." They spent the next hour talking, the conversation flowing with the same easy intimacy they shared on the phone, but amplified tenfold by the visual confirmation of their attraction. As they rose to leave, the tension of the impending separation was palpable. They stopped near the door, the noise of the cafe swirling around them. "So," Colin said, his voice dropping low, "the magic survived the light. What now?" "Now," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding against her ribs, "we have a real date." Colin smiled, a triumphant, warm curve of his lips. He leaned in, his intention clear. Sarah instinctively leaned forward, but he stopped short, pulling back just an inch. He simply wrapped his arms around her in a warm, lingering hug that lasted a little too long, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the coffee aroma. They pulled apart, both slightly breathless. "I'll call you," Colin promised. Sarah walked away, her entire body humming with a new, thrilling energy. She had found more than just a date. She had found a physical manifestation of her emotional lifeline. But as she walked, a small, cautious voice whispered in her mind, "Should we have stopped when the connection was only by voice?" The reality was beautiful, but the stakes were now terrifyingly high. Colin was determined to make their first official date unforgettable. He was used to planning events that left an impression, and he wanted to show Sarah the world he inhabited, the world he felt she deserved. He arrived at her apartment in a sleek black luxury sedan, opening the door for her with old-world courtesy. He had secured a reservation at the Zenith, a rooftop restaurant known for its exorbitant prices and breathtaking views of the city skyline. Sarah, however, was subtly resistant to the display of wealth. She looked lovely in a simple, elegant dress, but her demeanor was relaxed and genuine, completely unfazed by the opulence. As they settled into their secluded table, overlooking the glittering expanse of the city, Colin launched into a detailed description of the wine list, hoping to impress her with his knowledge. Sarah listened patiently, then gently steered the conversation away from the menu and toward a hilarious anecdote about a disastrous first day at her new job. "I tried to use the fancy coffee machine and ended up flooding the break room," she recounted, her eyes crinkling with amusement. "I swear, I'm good at contracts, but terrible at technology." Colin found himself laughing, a deep, unforced sound. He realized he wasn't talking about business or status. He was simply enjoying her company. He spent the first half of the dinner trying to impress her with details about his latest acquisition, subtly hinting at his power. Sarah listened politely, but her attention was drawn to a commotion near the kitchen entrance. A young waiter who had clearly spilled something and was mortified. "Oh, poor guy," Sarah murmured, her brow furrowed with sympathy. "That look of sheer panic. I know that feeling." Colin realized that while he was trying to dazzle her with the view and the price tag, Sarah was focused on the human element, the small moment of vulnerability in a stranger. She was completely genuine, not allowing herself to be impressed or intimidated by his money. Colin felt a strange frustration. His usual tools for connection, wealth, status, control, were failing him. He couldn't buy her attention. He had to earn it. "This is ridiculous," Colin suddenly announced, pushing his chair back. "We're having a lovely time, but this place is too stuffy. I have a better idea." He paid the bill, a sum that made Sarah's eyes widen slightly, despite her best efforts to remain calm, and led her back to the car. Instead of taking her home, he drove them to the city's old waterfront amusement park. The park was a riot of flashing neon, the smell of popcorn and sugar, and the joyful screams of the crowd. Colin shed his suit jacket, bought them 2 tickets, and dragged Sarah toward the roller coaster. He was like a child unleashed. His laughter was loud and carefree as they spun on the teacups and screamed on the rides. Sarah watched him, completely charmed. This was the man from the phone, the one who was messy, vulnerable, and seeking escape from his own rigid life. As they walked past the Ferris wheel, the air thick with the scent of the sea and fried dough, Colin stopped. He looked at Sarah, his eyes reflecting the flashing lights of the park. "I was trying too hard at dinner," he confessed, running a hand through his hair. "I was trying to be the billionaire Colin I thought you expected. But this is better." "Much better," Sarah agreed, reaching up to brush a piece of stray cotton candy from his cheek. "I like this, Colin." The moment was charged, spontaneous, and utterly real. Colin leaned down, and this time there was no hesitation. He kissed her. It was a spontaneous, slightly awkward kiss, tasting of salt and sugar, under the loud, garish lights of the carnival. It confirmed the physical attraction, the undeniable chemistry that had been simmering since the cafe. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. The kiss was a thrilling confirmation of their connection, but it also increased the stakes tenfold. The fantasy was officially over. Now they had to deal with the beautiful, terrifying reality. The next few dates followed a similar pattern, intense, thrilling, and complicated. They spent their time exploring the city, sharing quiet meals, and enjoying the sheer novelty of being together. Yet, a strange formality began to creep into their interactions. They were trying too hard to act casual, to protect the fragile, beautiful connection they had built over the phone. They avoided talking about the future, about their feelings, or about the elephant in the room. The fact that they were now physically involved, yet still operating under the no labels agreement. One afternoon, they were having lunch at a sunny outdoor bistro. The conversation was stilted. They were exchanging polite observations about the weather and the food, a stark contrast to the profound intimacy they had shared over the phone. Colin was describing a minor issue with a new investment property. Sarah was listening, but her mind was racing. They were trying to have a phone conversation while sitting directly across from each other, and it was failing hilariously. Sarah felt a wave of frustration wash over her. She needed the honesty, the directness that the telephone had afforded them. Without a word, she reached into her purse, pulled out her cell phone, and dialed Colin's number. Colin's phone, sitting on the table beside his water glass, immediately began to ring. He looked at it, then at Sarah, a confused frown creasing his brow. He answered the call. "Hello?" he said into the phone. Sarah held her phone to her ear, her voice dropping to the low, conspiratorial whisper they used at night. "Why are we acting like strangers, Colin?" she asked, her voice tight with exasperation. "Why is it easier to talk to you when I can't see your face?" Colin's posture changed instantly. The formality drained away, replaced by the vulnerable man she knew from the late-night calls. "Because the stakes are lower on the phone," he admitted into his device. "It's easier to be honest when you're just a voice. Now that you're here, now that I know how real you are, I'm terrified of saying the wrong thing." "But we know each other," Sarah argued, still speaking into her phone, even though he was only 3 feet away. "We know the broken parts. Why are we pretending we don't?" "Because if we define this, Sarah," Colin whispered, his voice thick with fear, "if we put a label on it, the magic might end, and I don't want the magic to end." Sarah's eyes softened. She understood. He was afraid of commitment because he was afraid of loss. She slowly lowered her phone. Colin, following her lead, gently ended the call and placed his phone on the table. He pushed his chair back and walked around the table to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was intense. "I'm afraid, Sarah," he confessed, his voice barely audible. "I'm afraid that if we call this a relationship, it will become like all the others, and I can't lose the connection we have." Sarah reached out and took his hand, her touch firm and reassuring. "We don't need a label, Colin. We just need to be honest. No more hiding behind the phone, and no more hiding behind the fear." They agreed to continue seeing each other, to let the relationship evolve naturally, without the pressure of a title. They had broken the ice, but the fear of commitment still loomed large. They had agreed on no labels, but the truth was, they were already deeply involved. The challenge was integrating the intimacy of the phone with the reality of their lives. Colin was determined to prove to Sarah that he could handle the reality of their relationship, chaos included. He planned their next date meticulously, aiming for a perfect blend of luxury and spontaneity. He had reserved a table at an exclusive, newly opened French restaurant, promising Sarah the best view in the city. He even had a backup plan, tickets to a private gallery opening afterward. He arrived at her apartment, impeccably dressed, a single perfect rose in his hand. "Tonight," he announced with a confident smile, "nothing will go wrong." Sarah laughed, a warm, melodic sound. "That's tempting fate, Colin." They set off, but fate, it seemed, was listening. First, traffic was gridlocked due to an unexpected protest. Colin, usually impatient, simply turned up the radio and started telling Sarah a hilarious story about a disastrous business trip to Tokyo. Sarah leaned back, enjoying the unexpected delay. When they finally arrived at the exclusive French restaurant, they found a note taped to the door. "Closed due to plumbing emergency." Colin's face fell. He ran a hand through his hair, a flicker of his old corporate frustration surfacing. "This is impossible. I confirmed the reservation twice." "It's fine," Sarah said, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We can go to the gallery." As they were walking back to the car, a sudden, torrential downpour erupted. They ran for cover, but not before they were both thoroughly drenched. "My perfect plan," Colin muttered, defeated. "It's a complete fiasco." "It's an adventure," Sarah corrected, shaking the water from her hair. "And look." They reached the car, only to find a flat tire. The final, absurd straw. Colin leaned his head against the steering wheel and burst out laughing. It wasn't a frustrated laugh. It was a deep, genuine, helpless sound of surrender. "You know what?" he said, wiping the rain from his face. "I give up. The universe clearly hates my attempts at perfection." "The universe loves our chaos," Sarah replied, pulling out her phone. "I know a place." Half an hour later, they were sitting in a brightly lit, slightly greasy diner, the kind with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner. They were still damp, but they were warm, sharing a massive plate of chili cheese fries and laughing until their sides ached. They talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing with the easy intimacy of their late-night calls. Sarah realized that these moments of shared, unscripted chaos were what she loved most about him. His ability to surrender to the imperfect was intoxicating. Colin looked at her, his eyes shining with a mixture of adoration and revelation. He saw her in the harsh fluorescent light, her makeup slightly smudged, her hair damp, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You know," he said, pushing a stray fry toward her, "I thought I needed a woman who was as organized and perfect as my life, but I need you. You make the chaos feel safe." As they finished their meal, the moment felt charged with a profound truth. Colin drove her home, the rain having subsided to a gentle drizzle. He walked her to her door, the silence between them heavy with all the unspoken feelings. He turned to her, his gaze intense. He didn't hesitate this time. "I love you, Sarah," he confessed, the words escaping him in a rush, spontaneous and unexpected, breaking the fragile rule of no labels. "I think I have since the first time I heard your voice." Sarah's breath hitched. The confession was terrifying, beautiful, and utterly real. The stakes had just reached a critical, unavoidable peak. The next day, Sarah did not answer her phone. She watched the screen light up with Colin's number. Once, twice, then a flurry of text messages. She felt a cold knot of panic tighten in her chest. "I love you." The words echoed in her mind, beautiful and terrifying. She paced her apartment, trying to rationalize the sudden, overwhelming confession. She remembered the pain of her divorce, the slow, agonizing realization that the person she loved was not who she thought he was. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the risk of being shattered again. He was just caught up in the moment, the rain, the diner, the chaos. She tried to convince herself that he didn't mean it, but the memory of the sincerity in his eyes was too powerful. She decided the only way to protect the connection, and herself, was to flee. She needed to put distance between them, to let the intensity cool down. She needed the safety of the telephone again. She was in the middle of packing a small bag, planning a spontaneous trip out of the city, when the doorbell rang. Sarah froze. She looked through the peephole. It was Colin. He wasn't angry or demanding. He was simply standing there, looking utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped. He looked like the vulnerable man from the first phone call, stripped of his confidence. She slowly opened the door. "I know," he said immediately, his voice low and quiet. "I shouldn't have said it. I broke the rule. I scared you." He didn't try to touch her or force the issue. He simply looked at her with an expression of profound sadness. "I won't apologize for feeling it," he continued, "but I will apologize for putting that pressure on you. I know you're afraid, Sarah. I know what it's like to build a wall so high that no one can get in. But I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to run away just because you need space." He paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. "I'm not going to let you push me away. I'm here, and I'll wait." His silent stand, his refusal to retreat, was the most powerful declaration of commitment she could have received. It broke through the last of her defenses. He wasn't trying to control her. He was offering her a safe space to feel. "I was packing," she confessed, gesturing vaguely toward the half-filled suitcase. "I was going to run." "I know," he said gently, "but you don't have to." Sarah stepped back, inviting him inside. The tension eased slightly, replaced by a deep, quiet understanding. They ordered takeout and ate dinner in comfortable, easy silence. The conversation was light, focused on the day's events, avoiding the monumental confession that hung in the air. As the evening wore on, Sarah felt the familiar comfort of his presence. She realized she didn't want him to leave. "It's late, Colin," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, standing up. "I should go." "No," she said quickly. "Stay, but I think you should sleep in the guest room." Colin's eyes softened with understanding. He didn't push, didn't argue, didn't even look disappointed. He simply accepted her boundary. "The guest room it is," he said, giving her a gentle, chaste kiss on the forehead. "Good night, Sarah." He walked down the hall, leaving her standing alone. Sarah felt a profound sense of relief and a thrilling anticipation. He had respected her fear, but he had refused to leave. The crisis had passed, and their connection had deepened, proving that their love was strong enough to survive the light, the chaos, and the fear of commitment. Colin settled into the guest room, the unfamiliar surroundings a strange contrast to the warmth of Sarah's home. He lay rigidly in the bed, staring at the ceiling. He was inches away from the woman he loved, yet separated by a thick wall of fear and past trauma. He reached for his phone. He couldn't sleep. He needed the intimacy, the safety of the connection they had first forged. He dialed her number. Sarah answered instantly, her voice low and intimate, as if she had been waiting. "I know this is ridiculous," Colin whispered into the phone. "I'm 2 rooms away, but I need to hear your voice." "I know," Sarah replied, a soft, understanding chuckle in her tone. "I'm lying here, staring at the ceiling, and I feel like I'm about to confess something terrible." The phone became their secure space again. They began to talk, not about the day, but about the fear that had driven them apart. "I'm afraid of your world, Colin," Sarah confessed, her voice barely audible. "I'm afraid you'll wake up one day and realize that my life is too small, too simple, that you'll get bored with the chaos." "I'm afraid of your simplicity, Sarah," Colin countered, his voice raw. "I'm afraid you'll realize that I'm just a complicated mess, trying to buy my way out of loneliness. I'm afraid you'll see my intensity as suffocating and run back to the safety of your organized life." They spoke for hours, dismantling the walls they had built around their hearts. The phone allowed them to be brutally honest, to confess the insecurities that their physical presence often masked. "I said I loved you," Colin admitted, his voice thick. "I meant it. I've loved you since the first time you laughed at my expense." "I love you too, Colin," Sarah confessed, the words feeling right and true. "But I'm terrified of the intensity. I need to know that if I give you my heart, you won't crush it." "Never," he promised. As they talked, Sarah slowly got out of her bed. She walked down the short hallway toward the guest room. She could hear Colin's voice through the thin wall, the sound a comforting anchor. She reached the door and gently pushed it open. Colin was sitting up in bed, the phone pressed to his ear, his eyes closed. He opened them and saw her standing there, illuminated by the soft hallway light. She walked to the side of the bed, still holding the phone to her ear. "I need more than a voice, Colin," she whispered into the device, her gaze locked on his. He slowly lowered the phone, placing it on the bedside table. The sound of their voices speaking through the technology ceased, replaced by the sound of their breathing in the quiet room. He reached out, taking her hand. He didn't pull her into the bed. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking her palm. "I'm here," he promised, his voice soft, no longer needing the phone to convey the intimacy. Sarah climbed into the bed beside him, pulling the covers over them. They lay side by side, their bodies close, the physical touch now more important than the voice. They didn't speak again. They simply held each other, the silence no longer charged with fear, but with the profound, comforting reality of their shared presence. The phone lay silent on the table, a relic of their past connection. Their love was no longer about the voice, it was about the presence. The next day marked a new phase in their relationship, the integration. Having conquered the fear of physical intimacy and the confession of love, they now faced the challenge of merging their two vastly different worlds. Colin was determined to show Sarah the reality of his life, not the fantasy of the diner or the park. He took her to his office, the gleaming glass-walled headquarters of his global investment firm. The environment was a stark contrast to Sarah's small, functional workspace. It was a fortress of wealth and power, filled with impeccably dressed executives who spoke in hushed, efficient tones. Sarah, dressed in a simple, professional outfit, walked through the halls with a quiet confidence. She didn't try to impress anyone. She simply observed, her honey-brown eyes taking in the scene with her usual gentle humor. During a quick lunch meeting with two of Colin's senior partners, the conversation revolved around complex financial mergers and acquisitions. Sarah listened attentively, occasionally interjecting with a surprisingly insightful question about contract law. One of the partners, a sharp, impeccably groomed woman named Evelyn, made a subtle, cutting comment, clearly testing Sarah. "It's charming how grounded you are, Sarah," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It must be quite a change from your usual environment." The implication was clear. Sarah was simple, a novelty, and didn't belong in their high-stakes world. Colin saw the flicker of annoyance in Sarah's eyes, but before she could respond, he intervened. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply reached across the table and took Sarah's hand, his grip firm and possessive. "Evelyn," Colin said, his voice measured and calm, but carrying the full weight of his authority. "Sarah's simplicity, as you call it, is what saved me from becoming a complete corporate automaton. Her grounded perspective is the only thing that keeps me sane." He looked directly at his partner, his hazel eyes intense. "She taught me that the most valuable assets in life aren't the ones you acquire. They are the ones you nurture. You should try it sometime." Evelyn immediately backed down, a flush rising on her neck. Sarah felt a profound warmth spread through her chest. Colin hadn't defended her. He had redefined his entire world for her. He wasn't trying to fit her into his life. He was changing the very foundation of his life to include her. Later, as they were leaving the office, Colin stopped her by the massive glass windows that overlooked the city. "I know this world is overwhelming," he confessed, his hand resting on the small of her back. "But I need you to know that you are not a guest here, Sarah. You are the architect of my new reality." Sarah looked up at the man who had once been a voice on the phone. He was no longer trying to hide his power, but he was using it to protect the genuine connection they shared. She realized that Colin wasn't trying to fit her into his world. He was dismantling the walls of his castle to make room for her. The integration was complete. Their love was strong enough to face the scrutiny of his high-powered life. It was Sarah's birthday. Colin, the man who could buy anything, was paralyzed by indecision. He had spent hours agonizing over the perfect gift. Should it be jewelry? A trip? Something that reflected his immense wealth? He knew Sarah. She would appreciate the gesture, but she would be uncomfortable with extravagance. She valued meaning over cost. He ended up spending the entire morning in a dusty, cluttered antique shop, searching for something that spoke to their unique beginning. He arrived at Sarah's apartment that evening, visibly nervous, carrying a small, oddly shaped package wrapped in brown paper. Sarah, radiant and happy, greeted him with a warm kiss. During dinner, Colin avoided the subject of the gift, his anxiety making him fidgety. "Okay, you're making me nervous," Sarah finally laughed, reaching for the package. "What is it?" Colin handed it over, his palms sweating. It's not much. But I hope you understand the sentiment." Sarah carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside was an old-fashioned, heavy rotary dial telephone. It was a rich, deep emerald green, the color of Colin's eyes. The metal was slightly tarnished, but the plastic was polished smooth. Sarah stared at it, her eyes filling with tears. It was the perfect gift. "It's beautiful, Colin," she whispered, tracing the smooth curve of the handset. "I found it in an old shop," he explained, his voice softer now. "It's completely functional. I want you to keep it by your bed, as a reminder." "Of what?" "Of how we started," he said, his gaze intense. "Of the fact that the most important thing we ever shared was just a voice and an honest connection. When the world gets too loud, or my life gets too complicated, you can look at that phone and remember that the magic is always there, waiting for us to dial in." Sarah stood up and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him into a deep, loving kiss. "The most valuable gift you ever gave me wasn't this phone, Colin. she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. It was the courage to love again. Thank you for that. The moment was charged with the certainty of their future. They had survived the initial shock, the fear of reality, and the integration of their worlds. We need a next step, Colin said, pulling back slightly, his eyes shining with purpose. No more half measures, no more separate apartments. I agree, Sarah said, her heart pounding. I want to spend a week with you, Colin proposed. No phone calls, no business, no distractions. Just us. We need to see if we can survive the silence and the proximity without the safety net of our routines. A week? Sarah challenged, a playful glint in her eye. Where? A remote cabin, no internet, no cell signal, just the two of us and the reality of our connection. Sarah smiled, her fear completely gone. The ultimate test, I accept. They sealed the agreement with a kiss, both knowing that this week would either solidify their future or expose the final, deepest fears they still held. The isolated cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from any cell tower. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind through the pines and the crackle of the fireplace. The first 2 days were strangely awkward. They were used to communicating through words, either the rapid-fire honesty of the phone or the witty banter of their dates. Now, forced into constant, quiet proximity, they stumbled. They discovered small, irritating habits. Colin's tendency to leave his clothes on the floor. Sarah's need to organize every cupboard she saw. The chaos that was so charming in a diner became slightly grating in the close confines of the cabin. They tried to talk, but the lack of the telephone's filter made the conversations feel heavy. They were trying to force the intimacy, and it wasn't working. On the third night, Sarah was sitting by the fire, reading, when Colin came in, looking frustrated. I can't do this, he confessed, running a hand through his hair. I feel like I'm losing you. I miss our calls. I miss the safety of knowing exactly what you're thinking without having to guess. We're relying on presence, Colin, Sarah said gently, not performance. It's harder. The true crisis hit on the 4th day. They were hiking, and Colin, used to navigating with GPS, got them hopelessly lost. They spent hours backtracking, the frustration mounting. When they finally returned to the cabin, soaked and exhausted, Sarah snapped. This is what I was afraid of, she exclaimed, throwing her wet jacket onto a chair. The chaos, the lack of control. You're brilliant in a boardroom, Colin, but here you're helpless. And I'm terrified that one day you'll look at my messy, chaotic life and realize you made a mistake. Colin stared at her, his face pale. And I'm terrified that you'll realize that the man you fell for on the phone, the one who was calm and centered, doesn't exist. He was a fantasy, Sarah. The real me is a control freak who gets lost in the woods. The argument was fierce, exposing the final raw nerve of their insecurities. Sarah sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. The silence that followed was suffocating. She realized her fear wasn't about his money or his chaos. It was about her own fear of commitment, her fear that the love she felt was too big, too intense to last. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. I can't lose you, Colin, she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. I can't go back to the gray. I love you, and the fear of losing this is bigger than any fear I've ever had. Colin rushed to her side, pulling her into a fierce, relieved embrace. He held her tightly, feeling the tension drain from her body. I love you too, Sarah, he whispered into her hair, his own voice thick with emotion. I've loved you since the first wrong number, and I will never let you go. He pulled back slightly, his eyes shining with a newfound clarity. The magic wasn't in the phone, Sarah. It was in the honesty. And we don't need the phone for that anymore. They spent the rest of the week talking, truly talking, about their future. The silence was no longer awkward. It was comfortable, a space for shared presence. When they finally drove back to the city, they were stronger, their connection forged not in the safety of anonymity, but in the crucible of reality. The test had been passed. They were back in the city, the intensity of the cabin replaced by the warm, familiar rhythm of their daily lives. The relationship was solid, built on the foundation of honesty and shared vulnerability. Colin was visibly nervous. He was about to face a challenge more daunting than any hostile takeover, meeting Sarah's parents. He viewed the encounter as the final, crucial step in integrating his life with hers. The meeting took place over a casual Sunday lunch at Sarah's parents' modest, welcoming home. The atmosphere was immediately warm. Sarah's mother was effusive and kind, and her father, Mr. Gaines, was a quiet, observant man with a gentle smile. Colin, surprisingly, was charming and relaxed. He didn't talk about business or money. He talked about Sarah, about their shared humor, and about the sheer absurdity of their meeting. The family adored him, laughing at his self-deprecating stories and appreciating his genuine affection for Sarah. As Sarah and her mother retreated to the kitchen to prepare dessert, Mr. Gaines leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. "Colin," he began, his voice low. "Can we talk for a moment?" Colin's stomach tightened. He braced himself for the inevitable interrogation about his wealth, his intentions, and his past. "Sir, I know my background is complicated," Colin started, ready to launch into a defense of his character. Mr. Gaines held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't care about the money, son. I care about my daughter. She has a good heart, and she's been through a lot. She built walls around herself, and for a long time, I thought she'd never let anyone in again." He looked directly at Colin, his gaze unwavering. "But you broke through. Not with money or status, but with a phone call. You made her laugh again, and you made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. The father's validation, far from being a threat, was a profound gift." Mr. Gaines leaned closer, his voice dropping to a solemn plea. "She has suffered enough, Colin. She is ready to trust again. Please promise me you will take care of her heart." Colin felt a lump form in his throat. This was a contract far more important than any business deal. "I promise you, Mr. Gaines," Colin said, his voice firm with absolute sincerity. "I will protect Sarah's heart with my life. She is the best thing that has ever happened to me." He realized that by accepting him, Sarah's father had lifted the final weight of fear from his shoulders. The fear of rejection, the fear of not being good enough, finally disappeared. As they stood up to rejoin the women, Colin knew the time for the final step had arrived. He was ready to make their connection permanent. The evening was cool and clear. Colin and Sarah were taking a leisurely walk through a quiet, tree-lined street in the city, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long, romantic shadows. The atmosphere was one of deep, comfortable intimacy. They talked about their future, about merging their lives, about the possibility of Sarah joining his foundation work, using her legal skills for social good. Colin stopped abruptly on the sidewalk, turning to face Sarah. He took her hands in his gaze intense. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. Sarah smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. "Another joke, Colin? Are we going to order a pizza?" He shook his head, his expression serious. He dialed her number. Her phone, nestled in her jacket pocket, rang instantly. She answered, laughing, playing along with the familiar ritual. "Hello?" she said into the phone. Colin, holding his phone to his ear, his voice thick with emotion, began to speak. "Ms. Gaines," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his love. "I'm calling to tell you that for 35 years, I thought I knew what success was. I thought it was about numbers, about control, about the next big deal." Sarah's expression changed as she realized the seriousness of the moment. She lowered her phone slightly, listening to the voice that had saved her. "I have met women who were interested in my money, my status, and my power," he continued, the vulnerability in his voice making her heart ache. "But you, Sarah, you were interested in the man who was lonely, the man who was broken, the man who dialed the wrong number." He paused, taking a deep, visible breath. You made me realize that all the money in the world means nothing if you don't have the right person to share the chaos with. You are my home, my peace, and my greatest adventure. He lowered the phone and gently placed it in his pocket. He then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a stunning ring. The central stone was a brilliant, deep emerald, the exact color of his eyes, symbolizing the profound connection they shared. He knelt down on one knee, right there on the quiet street. I'm calling to make a final, permanent contract, he said, his voice firm and unwavering. A contract with no expiration date, no fine print, and no way out. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with love. Sarah Gaines, will you marry me? Will you be my right number for the rest of our lives? Sarah's eyes were already swimming with tears. The moment was perfect, a beautiful blend of their past and their future. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Colin, 1,000 times yes. Colin, this is simply perfect. I accept with all my heart. Sarah's response was immediate and absolute. Colin rose from the pavement, the relief and joy washing over his face in a visible wave. He slid the emerald ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, the deep green stone shimmering under the streetlight, a constant reminder of the eyes that had first seen her soul. They celebrated their union right there on the quiet street, in a passionate, tearful kiss that sealed their two worlds together. In the following weeks, they began the joyous, chaotic process of planning their future. They decided on a small, intimate ceremony, one that reflected the honesty and simplicity of their connection. One evening, as they were finalizing the guest list, Sarah looked at Colin, a thoughtful expression on her face. You know, she confessed, leaning her head against his shoulder. I always knew, deep down, that the connection was real, even before I saw you. Your voice. It just felt like home. And your voice saved me from my own silence, Colin replied, kissing her hair. It was the only thing that cut through the noise. It's funny, Sarah mused. Everyone talks about fate, about destiny. But our destiny was decided by a typo. Colin smiled, a warm, genuine curve of his lips. Perhaps the universe just needed a little technological assistance to bring us together. It needed to bypass all the superficial filters, the money, the looks, the status, and go straight for the core. 6 months later, they stood in a small, sunlit chapel. It was the same modest chapel where Sarah's mother had been married, a place filled with history and genuine love. Only their closest friends and family were present. Colin, usually the picture of corporate control, was visibly moved, his eyes never leaving Sarah as she walked down the aisle. They exchanged vows that were simple, heartfelt, and deeply personal, filled with inside jokes and promises of shared chaos. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, they sealed their commitment with a kiss that was not a performance, but a confirmation. As they stood at the altar, surrounded by the love of their families, the certainty that destiny had brought them together with the help of a wrong number was absolute. 1 year later, Sarah and Colin were celebrating their first wedding anniversary. They were at home, in the kitchen of their newly renovated apartment, attempting to cook a complicated anniversary dinner. The kitchen, much like their life, was a beautiful, organized mess. Flour dusted the counter, and a cloud of smoke was currently billowing from the oven. Okay, I surrender, Colin announced, waving a dish towel frantically at the smoke detector. The universe clearly does not want me to master the beef Wellington. Sarah laughed, a warm, melodic sound that still gave Colin a thrill. It's fine, darling. We have a perfectly good pizza place on speed dial. Colin reached for his phone, but Sarah gently took it from his hand. Wait, she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. She walked to the corner of the kitchen, where the emerald green antique rotary phone sat on a small shelf, the simple gift that had become the symbol of their beginning. She picked up the handset and with a playful flourish began to dial. Colin watched her, confused. "Who are you calling?" "That phone only calls the landline." The landline phone, sitting on the counter right next to him, began to ring. Colin lifted the receiver, a puzzled smile on his face. "Hello?" he answered. Sarah, holding the antique phone to her ear, looked at him with all the love in the world. "Hello? Mr. Langford?" she said, her voice dropping to the low, intimate whisper they had first shared. "I'm calling to say that 1 year later, you are still the most interesting man I have ever met." She paused, her eyes shining with unshed tears of happiness. "And thank you," she finished, her voice full of profound gratitude. "Thank you for dialing the wrong number." Colin's eyes softened. He gently placed the receiver down, ignoring the dial tone. He crossed the kitchen floor in 2 strides, pulling Sarah into his arms. "You are the only number I ever needed to dial, Mrs. Langford," he murmured against her lips. He kissed her, a deep, loving kiss that celebrated not just their anniversary, but the beautiful, improbable fact that 2 strangers, broken by the past, had found their second chance at love through the simplest, most human of errors. Their love was the only connection that truly mattered.